This is Heliox, where evidence meets empathy. Independent, moderated, timely, deep, gentle, clinical, global, and community conversations about things that matter. Breathe easy, we go deep and lightly surface the big ideas. Imagine this scenario, a medic right in the thick of a crisis, facing an impossible choice. Who gets the last life-saving bit of kit when there just isn't enough? Or think about a first responder who witnesses a systemic failure, something that directly causes real harm, and they feel completely powerless. These aren't just, stressful moments or times of sadness. They can actually carve a deep, lasting wound right into a person's conscience. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really getting into moral injury. It's a concept that's getting more recognition, finally, but honestly, it's still widely misunderstood. It's not just the fear-based trauma many of us are more familiar with, like PTSD. It's a profound internal conflict. It strikes right at the core of someone's deeply held values. It's an internal wound that can actually shift your whole sense of who you are. Our deep dive today pulls from quite a range of sources. We've got legal insights, academic research on trauma and psychology, and even specific guides written for public safety personnel. Our mission really is to define moral injury clearly, show how it's different from things like PTSD, understand its far-reaching impacts, and then explore the pathways to healing and even growth. We want to give you, our listener, a kind of shortcut to being genuinely well-informed on this vital topic, maybe uncover some surprising facts along the way. So let's unpack this. What exactly is moral injury at its heart?
Well, what's really fascinating here, it isn't just about feeling distressed emotionally. It's a specific psychological injury. It happens when someone does something or witnesses something or even fails to prevent something that goes deeply against their own conscience, their core moral beliefs, or even their fundamental expectations of themselves. It's often rooted in this feeling that a really profound line has been crossed, whether it's by them, by someone else, or maybe even an organization they trusted.
Right, so it's like a wound to the soul, in a sense. And traditionally, this idea was studied mostly with military veterans, wasn't it?
Exactly. That's where a lot of the initial research happened.
Yeah, thinking about examples like participating in killing or harming, seeing immense death, failing to stop what they felt were immoral acts, or maybe receiving or even giving orders that just felt deeply wrong.
Precisely. Yeah. And while it really started there, our understanding has broadened out quite dramatically now. It goes way beyond just the military context. We see it in public safety personnel, police, firefighters, paramedics, and crucially even healthcare workers. For them, it could be the crushing weight of making those tough triage calls, or figuring out how to allocate scarce resources in a crisis, or maybe feeling this overwhelming guilt for surviving when others didn't, or even that heavy burden of potentially infecting people during, say, a pandemic. Yeah. It's about that deep clash between what they believe is right and what the situation forces on them.
That's a really key distinction, isn't it? Because so many people hear trauma and their mind just jumps straight to PTSD. But the research we've looked at makes it very clear they are distinct things.
They really are.
PTSD, that's a diagnosed mental disorder, right?
Yeah.
Often based on fear. And a moral transgression isn't actually necessary for someone to develop it.
Mm-hmm.
Someone could go through a terrifying event, develop PTSD, but not feel like they violated any moral code.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, moral injury is often thought of as more of a dimensional problem, which means it's kind of like a spectrum, not just a diagnosis you either have or you don't. You might experience it to varying degrees. It makes it a bit more nuanced than a simple yes-no label. It's specifically rooted in that feeling of transgression, that sense that someone maybe oneself crossed a line. And the really deep insight here is that even though some symptoms do overlap with PTSD, a PTSD diagnosis often just doesn't adequately capture that profound shame and guilt that's so central to moral injury.
Okay, so you can have one without the other.
Absolutely. It's vital to get that moral injury can exist without PTSD. And studies show that events where someone felt they perpetrated an act, even by not acting, by omission, are linked to much more intense guilt and self-blame compared to traumas that were purely fear-based.
Okay, so there's overlap. Things like anger, depression, insomnia, nightmares, anxiety, maybe substance abuse. Those can show up in both.
Yes, those are common overlaps.
But moral injury has these specific emotional hallmarks, what really sets it apart.
You're right. The unique hallmark reactions, they really stand out. We're talking about profound, ongoing grief, intense guilt, and this really crippling shame. And there's a vital difference we need to touch on between guilt and shame. Guilt is often described as, I did something bad. Shame, though, that's deeper. It's, I am bad because of what I did.
Wow, yeah.
That fundamental belief, I am bad, that's what can make healing from moral injury uniquely challenging.
I can see that.
Another really significant one is social alienation. A deep withdrawal, isolation, maybe pushing loved ones away, even distancing from one's own feelings. Then there's this pervasive lack of trust and real difficulty with self-forgiveness, which unfortunately can lead to self-sabotaging behaviors, believing you don't deserve success or happiness.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's anhedonia, that's the inability to feel pleasure, either socially or physically. And finally, it often hits one's spirituality hard, leading to questioning core beliefs, maybe a relationship with a higher power, or even the very meaning of life itself.
That breakdown of guilt versus shame.
Yeah.
That's incredibly powerful. It really makes you realize how deeply personal this is. It strikes right at how someone defines themselves. Our sources talk about something called the MEV framework, morals, ethics, and values. Can you walk us through those and how they connect to this kind of injury?
Absolutely. This is a helpful way to frame it. Think of it like this. Morals are like the universal laws, the bedrock principles for how societies function, things like preserving life, seeking truth, treating others fairly, the big stuff.
Okay.
Then you have ethics. These are more context-driven codes of behavior based on those broader morals. So think of specific professional codes, like for paramedics or police officers, rules of conduct for a role.
Okay.
And finally, values. These are more personal concepts, things we freely choose that guide our individual beliefs and actions. They often reflect how a person actually behaves, what they prioritize day to day. When a moral injury happens, it profoundly damages a person's character, identity, and deepest sense of self. That's why people often feel lost or broken or just not who they used to be. It's because those core values they built their life around suddenly feel impossible to express or live up to. It attacks the very core of who they believe they are.
That makes total sense. And the sources lay out 3 broad categories for these, potentially morally injurious events or PMIEs. Can you give us a quick, maybe concrete example for each as you describe them?
Sure thing. First, you've got self-oriented moral transgressions. This is where someone does something or maybe fails to do something that goes against their own MEV framework. So, for instance, a firefighter might feel immense guilt, believing they didn't do enough to save someone. Even if objectively they did everything possible, it's about their perception of failing their own standards. Then there are other-oriented moral transgressions. This is witnessing others committing acts that violate those moral codes. An example could be maybe a police officer seeing a colleague use excessive force or act unethically and feeling powerless or conflicted about intervening. And third is betrayal. This is a moral transgression by a person or a group they trusted. Think leadership, the organization itself, maybe even peers. This could be like a paramedic realizing their department knew about faulty equipment but didn't fix it, leading to harm. That creates a deep sense of organizational betrayal. And remember, these can be acts of commission, things purposefully done, or acts of omission, things purposefully not done when action felt morally necessary.
It's heavy just thinking about it. And these aren't always single events, right? Sometimes it's this constant grinding exposure. You mentioned responses vary based on several elements.
That's right. The response isn't uniform at all. It really depends on, well, at least 5 key elements we see in the research. Things like the sheer number and intensity of these exposures, the person's specific role in the event, their perceived agency, how much control they felt they had. Also, their own personal MEV framework matters a lot. And importantly, whether they see any possibility of repairing the violation, of making amends, or things being put right.
And for public safety personnel specifically, what kind of PMIEs are common?
For PSP, yeah, common examples often include things like witnessing suffering they can't alleviate due to lack of resources, or being unfairly blamed by the public or media for things outside their control, feeling insufficiently supported by leadership or their organization after traumatic events, that chronic draining exposure to societal issues like homelessness or addiction without adequate solutions, and even experiencing outright hostility from the public, which, as you can imagine, really spiked for many during events like the COVID-19 pandemic. These aren't just one-offs. It can be a constant drip, drip, drip.
Now, when people experience this kind of deep emotional pain, it's natural to want to pull back, right? To numb it, distract from it, suppress it. But you mentioned something called the pain paradox, which raises a really important question. Why does trying to avoid the pain often end up making it worse?
It's such an insidious cycle, isn't it? The pain paradox basically explains that when we make these unskillful attempts to lessen emotional pain, pushing it away, numbing it. We often inadvertently make it last longer or even intensify it because the avoided material, the painful stuff, it can't be engaged with, it can't be processed or psychologically metabolized, as the researchers put it.
So you can't work through it if you're constantly pushing it down.
Exactly, it just gets stuck, kind of festering under the surface. And our culture sometimes reinforces this, doesn't it? Messages like, just get over it, or suggesting we should just numb discomfort. But that avoidance rarely works in the long run. It often just entrenches the very pain someone's trying desperately to escape.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it, how many people might be caught in that loop without even realizing the root cause is this moral dimension. And the ripple effects, they're huge. Moral injury impacts so many parts of life. It's definitely not just an internal battle.
Oh, absolutely. Across different areas of life, the impact is really significant.
Yeah.
Occupationally, for instance, we see burnout, compassion fatigue,
Yeah.
reduced ability to work effectively, and sometimes, tragically, people leaving professions they once loved entirely.
Yeah.
Psychologically, it can show up as self-destructive behaviors, really harsh self-criticism, and alarmingly increased suicidal thoughts and attempts. And that's notably higher even when you account for co-occurring PTSD and depression. It is. Emotionally, there's often a stark decrease in positive emotions. Things like awe, joy, pleasure, alongside really intense negative ones. Profound guilt, shame, anger, disgust, contempt, despair, hopelessness. Socially, it leads to deep isolation, strained relationships, feeling profoundly disconnected even when you're physically around others. And spiritually, as we touched on, it can cause a real crisis, questioning fundamental beliefs about humanity, the world, life's meaning, immense difficulty with forgiveness of self or others, deep existential doubt.
You just touched on something incredibly important there, how individual experiences of this can vary so much. What are some of those key factors that really shape how someone experiences moral injury, especially when we think about things like equity and diversity?
That's a critical point, yeah. How someone experiences moral injury isn't monolithic. It can differ significantly based on things like sex, gender, ethnicity, culture. For example, individuals who already face systemic discrimination or injustice, they might be at increased risk. Those experiences can layer on additional moral burdens,
Makes sense.
For certain groups, systemic racism or intergenerational trauma can amplify the impact of moral injury, making it even harder to process or heal from. And we also see specific issues like gender inequities for female public safety personnel. Things like experiencing sexual misconduct within the ranks or witnessing more betrayal-based moral injury from their own organizations. These are noted as significant specific risks. So the way these diverse personal factors interact with the organizational ethics and behaviors, that really influences how moral injury shows up and how severe the mental health challenges become.
That really highlights just how complex this internal wound is. It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all experience, but it's also important to say not everyone who goes through a PMIE ends up with negative outcomes, right? Some people can actually develop more resilience, self-compassion, even greater engagement with their work. So what's the flip side here?
Yeah, exactly. This brings us to the really empowering concept of moral resilience, which is basically the ability to adapt, to resolve that adversity, and regain a sense of identity and wholeness after a morally challenging event. Public safety personnel often have these really strong pro-social characteristics like an innate sense of duty, a profound desire to help. And those very qualities, they can be leveraged. They can become sources of immense moral strength, potentially leading to what we call post-traumatic growth. This allows individuals to integrate their experiences, maybe find a renewed sense of purpose, and sometimes even emerge with their values stronger or clearer than before.
So if someone is struggling, or if you know someone who might be, where can they find support? Let's start with strategies at the organizational level, maybe the team level. What actually makes a difference in creating a healthier environment? Creating psychologically and ethically safe workplaces is absolutely paramount. It's foundational. This means having clear policies, but also fostering empathetic leaders who actually understand these burdens. Having positive role models. It's really about cultivating a culture where open communication is okay, where what some sources call interpersonal risk-taking, meaning it's genuinely safe to speak up, to share struggles, to ask for help, is encouraged and rewarded, not seen as weakness or punished.
Okay.
Then there's the idea of moral resilience training. This kind of training can proactively prepare PSP for PMIEs. It helps increase their self-awareness of their own MEVs, their own morals, ethics, values, and builds confidence in making moral decisions, sometimes using realistic scenario training to navigate those tricky ethical dilemmas before they happen in real life.
And leaders. Clearly, they have a massive role to play in this. Oh, huge. Leaders have a crucial responsibility here. Building these supportive cultures, using transparent communication about PMIEs and the organization's own ethics. Providing longer-term strategies, too, like sensible staff rotation, making sure there's adequate decompression time after really critical incidents. And finally, team cohesion is just vital. Teams that stick together, that have high morale, they are inherently psychologically safe environments. Members can support each other, spot symptoms early, help each other access care when needed. It really is about looking out for each other.
Moving beyond the organization, what about formal support? Mental health professionals obviously play a critical role. They're vital in identifying moral injury, even if the symptoms don't show up right away. But how do they actually tackle something so deeply internal?
Well, traditional trauma treatments, things like prolonged exposure, PE, or cognitive processing therapy, CPT, they can definitely help with the PTSD-like symptoms that might come with moral injury. But sometimes that core guilt and shame, it can linger. It often requires a more explicit focus on the PMIE itself, the moral dimension. And what's fascinating here is the rise of newer specialized treatments that are being investigated specifically to target moral injury. These aren't just generic talk therapies. They include specialized approaches. For instance, some focus on helping individuals reconnect their actions with their core values, like acceptance and commitment therapy or ACT, adapted for MI. Others directly tackle those difficult questions of blame, making amends, finding forgiveness. Things like adaptive disclosure or trauma-informed guilt reduction therapy, often called TRIG-ERR. There are also interventions like impact of killing, specifically for military contexts or moral injury group, which might be co-led by a chaplain and a psychologist, sometimes using public testimony as part of healing. And finally, approaches like building spiritual strength specifically help people reconnect with their sense of purpose and meaning. But critically, for any clinician working in this space, conveying and accepting completely non-judgmental stance is key. And being really aware of their own assumptions about morals and values, that's crucial.
And it's not just about formal therapy, right? Informal support, social networks, family, peers, that's incredibly important too.
Oh, absolutely. That's a huge protective factor. Encouraging engagement in meaningful social activities, maybe volunteering, nurturing personal relationships, just having leisure activities that can directly counter the social withdrawal we often see with MI. Peer support is invaluable. Being able to connect with others who have shared experiences, who truly get it, builds trust in a unique way. And family members, close friends, they can provide those safe spaces for discussion. And importantly, they can help facilitate access to professional care if it's needed. Psychoeducation for these informal supports is really key, though, so they understand what moral injury is and how to offer genuine help, rather than accidentally saying something that adds to the burden.
Okay, so pulling this all together, what does this mean for you, our listener? If you or perhaps someone you know is struggling, what are the individual practices for healing that can really make a difference?
Yeah, individual self-care practices are essential. It starts with increasing self-awareness, knowing your own morals, ethics, and values, what really matters to you. Actively seeking psychoeducation about moral injury helps. Just understanding it is powerful. Learning to recognize the specific moral symptoms in yourself, like that avoidance or loss of trust. And it's really crucial to actively work on distinguishing who one is from what one has done or failed to do. To avoid internalizing those negative beliefs about yourself, regularly engaging in self-reflection and expression, maybe through journaling or expressive arts, that can be incredibly powerful for processing. Spiritual practices can also provide immense support for many. Things like cultivating hope, practicing gratitude, mindfulness, prayer, meditation, guided imagery, or even just spending quiet time in nature, finding that sense of connection.
So we've taken a deep dive today into moral injury. We've distinguished it as this distinct, profound type of internal wound, different from PTSD, rooted in the violation of deeply held values. We've explored its far-reaching impacts, how it can touch every aspect of a person's life. But, importantly, we've also seen that there are many pathways to healing. There's resilience, even moral growth possible, through individual practices, strong team support, better organizational structures, and specialized professional care. As you go about your day, maybe just consider this. How can our collective understanding, our support for those experiencing moral injury, whether they're veterans, first responders, healthcare workers, anyone carrying this kind of burden, how can that transform not just their lives, but maybe the very fabric of our communities?
Thanks for listening today. 4 recurring narratives underlie every episode: boundary dissolution, adaptive complexity, embodied knowledge, and quantum-like uncertainty. These aren't just philosophical musings, but frameworks for understanding our modern world. We hope you continue exploring our other podcasts, responding to the content, and checking out our related articles at helioxpodcast.substack.com.